Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 38 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. As many of you know, I'm also the editor of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics blog, and if you follow my blog, you'll know this week I'm attending the SCCE Utilities and Energy Conference here in Houston. As with all conferences the SCCE puts on, it is a wealth of information geared towards the compliance practitioner. Lots of nuts and bolts information and indeed nuts and bolts sessions. So we've had some very interesting sessions over the past couple of days. And for the episode today, I would like to report on one of those, which was by David Douglas of Kansas City Power and Light, where his topic was the new compliance vision, cutting edge or bleeding edge. David is with compliance at Kansas City Light Power. And one of the things that I've come to really enjoy about this particular conference is the merging or the marrying of compliance practitioners from the utility industry with those from the energy industry. The utility industry, as most of you probably know, is one of the most regulated industries in the United States. There's FERC, there's NERC, there's state regulatory agencies, all geared towards keeping power up and running and regulating transportation of interstate electricity and other energy-related products. Because of that, they are very process-oriented in the utilities industry. And I believe that we in the energy industry, and indeed really any other industry that engages in anti-bribery and anti-corruption compliance regimes, could learn a lot from the utility industry and how they deal with NERC, FERC, and other types of compliance. So in today's episode, I would like to talk about Mr. Douglas's presentation and some of the things that struck me that could be particularly helpful to you in the anti-bribery, anti-corruption compliance space. The first thing is, as with other areas of compliance, such as export control, such as anti-money laundering, the compliance process is basically the same. And if you look at some of these other types of compliance processes, or is what Howard Sklar would say is compliance convergence, you understand that the process is relatively similar. Some of the specifics may be a little bit different. Gifts and entertainment, obviously foreign governmental officials for compliance with the FCPA. But the process is relatively the same, and it gives you the ability as the anti-corruption or anti-bribery compliance practitioner to benchmark your program against those from other industries. And I think this can be quite a helpful exercise. The first concept that I'd like to talk about relate that Mr. Douglas talked about, I blogged about it, and it was a model which he called the compliance maturity model. And he talked about compliance at 4 different levels of maturity. The first was reacting, the second was anticipating, the third one was collaborating, and the fourth one was orchestrating. And this, he started out with this compliance maturity model, and I think it gives you a very good idea to assess where your compliance program might be in terms of maturity within your company. So for instance, in step 1, stage 1, the reacting, this is typically the lowest level of maturity, and this is a situation where you're responding generally in a panic mode. Compliance is out there as a sole island in a company without much support, both in terms of resources and personnel. Your admonition is generally just to get compliance done, and you only can marshal resources when and where you can find them. So a very low level of maturity of compliance at stage 1. Stage 2, anticipating, or the anticipation of compliance. This is an increased level of maturity which can help bring you some efficiencies to your compliance program, generally through and a practice of some type of automation. As you know, my mantra in all things FCPA compliance is document, document, document. And certainly automation, sorry about that, can help you to document what you're doing, but more importantly, be able to call that documentation up if a regulator ever comes knocking. So this is really the first step in the maturity model where we see automation come into play. But with automation, in addition to the document mantra of Tom Fox, it allows you to see connections between multiple programs and across multiple business lines, and take perhaps plan a little bit to take future steps to prevent, certainly detect, but also prevent compliance programs, compliance violations, I should say, before they become full-blown illegal acts or other nefarious problems. The next step on stage 3 is collaboration. And under this step, compliance moves to being seen as a collaborative partner with the business units, and this allows identification of risks, the assessment of risks, and then the managing those risks through a prioritization of those risks. This step also, the collaboration step, also allows you to reuse technological components for multiple purposes. This gives you the opportunity to reinforce the cost savings and value to the company. And finally, the fourth and final stage in the compliance maturity model is orchestration. And with orchestration, you really are able to have your compliance function embedded into the DNA of the company. In this ultimate stage, compliance works with the entire throughout the entire enterprise to help set objectives, to coordinate enterprise risk analysis and response. And there's a corporate-wide visibility for compliance, but more importantly for the aspects of compliance that you would engage in as a compliance practitioner. So such as risk analysis, such as risk management, such as remediation. All of these would be not only accepted but embraced by the company. They would be embraced by the company at the highest level, obviously at the board of directors, but also at senior leadership. You would have a chief compliance officer who hopefully would have that visibility within the company. So those are really the 4 stages of compliance maturity, at least as outlined by Mr. Douglas. And it gives you the ability to really sort of figure out where you are in the maturity of your client's compliance program. But it also gives you some of the steps that, or at least the indicia of what might take you to another level of maturity for your compliance program. I try to emphasize that when you begin your journey in your corporate compliance program, or as you enhance it, you don't have to take a large number of very big steps. Sometimes little steps are equally important. But if you take those little steps and you build upon those steps, you can move up through a level of maturity and to garner more resources through showing the business unit the advantages of compliance and how you can then embed that down into a business unit level so that you move towards stage 4, which is the orchestration phase. Many people, or rather, if you do a risk assessment, and of course it all starts with a risk assessment, from the risk assessment, then you can put together a 1, 3, or 5-year compliance plan. You can modify this compliance plan as your maturity level and technological innovations allow you to do so. But the important thing is that you would have a plan in place. If you do a risk assessment, I advocate that you have a 12-month plan for implementation of any enhancements you see required going forward. So once again, you don't have to start immediately, but it's important that you have a written document in place that you can show a regulator. These are the steps we've identified. These are the steps that we're going to take over the next year. And after that program, or after that, we've implemented these enhancements, and we will then reassess where we are in terms of our risk, but also what's available to us in current best practices. So once again, the maturity model allows you to see where you are and what steps you might be able to take, even if they're small or baby steps. I think what the Department of Justice wants to see you do is moving forward in compliance. Certainly as the Department of Justice's views mature on what's the best practices compliance program, these are things that you can look at implementing into your overall compliance regime. We heard Scott Lane from the Red Flag Group talk about transaction monitoring and really the cutting edge of transaction monitoring. That may be past the level of where you are currently in your compliance program, and that's fine. But the point is, at some point, transaction monitoring is going to move from a cutting edge technology to a best practice to a routine compliance practice. And specifically with transaction monitoring, we've seen that moving forward from the Morgan Stanley declination of almost 2 years ago in April 2012 through the Eli Lilly enforcement action, FCPA enforcement action at the end of 2012, through the Weatherford and the Diebold enforcement actions in Q4 of 2013. So the Department of Justice's views evolve, their views on best practices evolve, although one thing they've consistently said is that your compliance program is a living, breathing organism, and it's not a paper program, so that if you have this risk assessment, if you have proposed enhancements based on the risk assessment, which is assessing your risk and moving forward to remediate or enhance your risk management, this is where I think the department wants you to go, and I think that's what they're talking about when they talk about compliance as a living, breathing program within your company, driving it into the DNA so it can react to not only your company's changes, but changes in market conditions and changes in the types of compliance tools that are available to you. But Douglas had a couple of other items that I would like to note for you that I found interesting that could perhaps assist you in marketing your compliance program. The first of these was he looked at FERC, that's the Federal Energy and Regulatory Commission's 7 standards for an effective compliance program. Excuse me. Number 1, and I'm just going to have to read these, sorry. Number 1, internal standards and procedures to prevent and detect violations. Number 2, high-level management knowledge and oversight of internal compliance programs. Number 3, reasonable due diligence efforts to screen out poor performers. That's both internal to your company and in the utility industry, internal to your company and external third-party providers and other third parties that you may do business with. Number 4, reasonable internal communications and training efforts. Note the conjunctive there where they have both communication and training. It's not simply training, it's also communications. What are you doing on a routine basis to communicate the message of compliance to your company? Number 5, reasonable steps to evaluate program effectiveness. That sounds suspiciously like a risk assessment, including confidential option reporting for employees. So in the FERC world, they would like you to look at or have your employees be a part of your effectiveness, and they would allow or suggest that confidential reporting be a part of that, i.e. hotline. Number 6, creating and enforcing compliance incentives and compliance sanctions, the carrot and the stick. This is something that the department has started talking about. They certainly talked about it in the FCPA guidance. The stick approach is something that's been well known. You need to discipline, terminate, or in some way remediate the bad actors who engage in compliance violations in the FCPA world. But here we specifically talk about, or at least FERC specifically talks about compliance incentives. So do you have any compliance incentives in your program? Do you have part of your discretionary bonus if you pay a year in discretionary bonus? Is it part of it based on a compliance assessment? Is a compliance assessment a part of a candidate's interview process? Is a compliance assessment a part of the process to determine when employees are elevated to management or senior management position? And certainly if you bring in a senior manager promoted within the company, you need to take a look at their compliance track record. Obviously, it moves to due diligence and other third parties, but here they're specifically focusing on compliance incentives, which is something that typically does not get as much play as the stick part of compliance, which are the sanctions. And number 7, after detection of a violation, companies shall take reasonable responsive steps to remediate. If you've ever heard me talk about Paul McNulty's 3 maxims, they're what did you do to prevent it, what did you do to detect it, but most importantly, what did you do when you found out about it? In other words, how did you remediate? In the FCPA guidance, the Department of Justice and SEC say prevent, detect, and remediate. But here in step number 7, FERC says take reasonable responsive steps. And I really like the reasonable responsive steps because that's something that many companies I don't think fully appreciate is the reasonableness of the steps. If you've had a major compliance breach, to remediate may take a major rework of your compliance program. If you've had a minor compliance breach, a reasonable step might be a relatively minor response to that in terms of remediating directly if it's one or two people. So the reasonableness is built into the FERC model, and I think that's something that you should consider for your FCPA anti-bribery and anti-corruption compliance program. Next, Douglas cited to the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, as I've come to learn, 4 hallmarks of an effective compliance program. And although there are 4 hallmarks, they have several subparts. So once again, apologizing for my reading. Number 1, senior management and leadership. Is your compliance program established within your company? Is your compliance program formally documented and widely disseminated throughout the organization? Is the compliance program supervised by high-ranking officials within your company? Does the head of your compliance function have access to not only the board of directors, but the president and the CEO, or CEO, I should say? Is the compliance program designed and run with independence? Are there sufficient resources dedicated to the compliance program? Once again, something that really doesn't get a lot of play, which is the resources that a company would dedicate to a compliance program. But here under the NERC's 4 hallmarks of an effective compliance program, it's right up here on number 1, which are your resources. And does the compliance program have the full support of the company leadership? Number 2, what are the preventative measures you have in place? Remember the 3 parts from the FCPA guidance: prevent, detect, and remediate. So here, what are the preventive measures you have in place? Which would suggest a sufficient frequency of review of your compliance program. Obviously in the FCPA world, that probably means annually. There's a sufficient training of employees on compliance, but more than simply the rote training of your employees on compliance is the training material sufficient? So in my last or 2 podcasts ago, I visited with the FCPA professor about a new training video that he helped produce, and also wrote about it. I think it's very good training, but is the training you're given sufficient for your target audience? So the high-risk employees who are doing business overseas, are they receiving the same training as the employees who may be working on your SAP system in the United States, who might be doing contracts or other work in the United States that's not foreign commerce centric? So is your training sufficient? Number 3, prompt detection, cessation, and self-reporting. There is a sustainable process to internally assess compliance with regulations. Next, there is a sufficient response to identification of wrongdoing and misconduct. And then the last point, which is effective remediation. Are there effective internal controls and procedures in place not only to prevent the conduct, but also tie back into your detection and prevention prongs? So I think these 2 NERC and FERC hallmarks or guidelines for compliance programs can be quite useful to you going forward as a compliance practitioner. Obviously, the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program are an excellent benchmark for you to utilize. Any of the recent deferred prosecution agreements, if you look at attachment C, have the Department of Justice's views on the current state of best practices of a compliance program. You can look at the OECD 13 good practices of an effective compliance program. If you wanted to take a look at Paul McNulty and Stephen Martin's 5 steps of an effective compliance program, that's another great resource. But the point is, there are a number of resources out there. You can even look at the UK Bribery Act, the 6 principles of adequate procedures compliance defense, or compliance program, which would lead to a compliance defense. There are a large number of resources out there. If you don't know or don't have access to those, I'm happy to share them with you. So with that, I would say once again, I'm Tom Fox. And if you want to reach me or have any questions on today's podcast or today's episode 38, I can be reached at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report, and I hope to see you again on my next episode. Thank you very much.